12 helicopters, 1 airfield, 12 minutes on the ground. That was the Russian squadron's entire window of vulnerability. 12 minutes to refuel, reload, and get back into the air. 12 minutes when every Ka-52 Alligator and Mi-28 Havoc in the formation sat exposed on the same concrete apron, rotors winding down, fuel trucks rushing in, armament crews scrambling to reattach rocket pods. The Russian pilots thought 12 minutes was too short for any threat to matter. Ukrainian intelligence knew 12 minutes was more than enough. I'm your host at Ukraine Radar, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What you're about to hear is the story of a pattern-of-life operation that took weeks of satellite observation, dozens of drone reconnaissance passes, and 1 moment of perfect precision to execute. The target was a Russian rotary wing squadron using a captured southern airfield as a hot refuel point between combat sorties. The outcome was the complete destruction of that squadron on the ground. Every aircraft turned into burning wreckage before a single Russian pilot could reach a cockpit. This is how Ukraine waited. This is how Ukraine struck. And this is why every Russian commander in the theater is now terrified of the word routine. To understand what happened, you need to understand what Russia was doing with this airfield in the first place. Deep in the occupied southern territory, Russian forces had converted what was once a civilian agricultural airstrip into a forward operating base for rotary wing assets. The strip itself was modest. Roughly 1,400 meters of patched concrete, 2 taxiways, a cluster of prefabricated hangars at the northern end, and a fuel farm that Russian logistics engineers had expanded 3 times over in the months following occupation. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't protected by serious layered air defense, but it was close to the front. Close enough that attack helicopters could fly combat sorties, return to refuel and rearm, and be back over Ukrainian positions within 40 minutes of wheels down. That proximity was the airfield's entire tactical value. And that proximity was also what made it a target. The Russian squadron assigned to this airfield was a composite formation built around 2 primary platforms. 8 Ka-52 Alligators, the twin-seat coaxial attack helicopter that Russia considers its most capable rotary wing asset. 4 Mi-28 Havocs, the single-rotor gunship that pairs with the Ka-52 in mixed formations. Between them, the 12 aircraft carried a substantial armament package. Each Ka-52 could deploy up to 12 Vickers anti-tank missiles, with a range of 8 kilometers and a laser-guided seeker capable of defeating Ukrainian armor at standoff distances that made short-range air defense engagement difficult. The Mi-28S carried similar loadouts, plus unguided rocket pods for area suppression. On a full armament cycle, this 12-aircraft formation had enough firepower to engage and destroy an entire Ukrainian armored battalion. Russia was using it exactly that way, flying 2-ship and 4-ship sorties against Ukrainian positions, pressing close enough to deploy missiles and rockets, then breaking hard east and returning to the airfield. The crews were flying 3 to 4 sorties per day. They were good at their jobs, they were getting results, and they were developing habits. Which weapon was deadlier in this operation? The strike drones, the GPS-guided munitions, or the satellite reconnaissance that made everything possible? A. Strike drones. B. GPS-guided munitions. C. Satellite reconnaissance. Drop your answer in the comments below. Ukrainian military intelligence, the GUR, had been watching this airfield since the occupation of the surrounding territory. Initial satellite passes confirmed the presence of rotary wing assets, but not their operational pattern. That required time. That required patience. That required methodical observation rather than a rush strike on an incomplete picture. The GUR assigned a dedicated team to pattern-of-life analysis on this airfield. Over several weeks, that team compiled observation data from multiple sources. Commercial satellite imagery from operators who contract with Ukrainian defense institutions gave overhead coverage at irregular intervals. Ukrainian-operated reconnaissance drones, small, fixed-wing platforms at medium altitude, provided additional passes when weather and Russian air defense permitted. SIGINT collection on Russian aviation frequencies added a second dimension. The team could hear the squadron's radio traffic, call signs, fuel states, sortie requests. The mundane radio chatter of a flight operation settling into comfortable routine. The picture that emerged was remarkably consistent. The squadron operated on a defined daily cycle. Morning sorties launched between 5:30 a.m. and 7 a.m., the pre-dawn and early daylight window when Russian commanders believed Ukrainian air defense would be managing overnight threats and slower to respond to low-altitude helicopters. The aircraft would fly their missions, lasting between 40 and 70 minutes depending on target distance and threat environment, then return to the airfield for the hot refuel cycle. That cycle, wheels down to wheels up, ran between 10 and 14 minutes in observed instances. Ukrainian analysts flagged the consistency. In 16 observed cycles across multiple sortie sequences, the ground time never exceeded 14 minutes and never dropped below 10. The airfield's ground crew had it down to a choreography. Fuel trucks in position before the helicopters landed. Armament teams with pre-staged rocket pods waiting at the revetments. Pilots staying in cockpits during refuel to cut turnaround time. The squadron commander, identified through SIGINT as a decorated aviation officer with considerable combat experience, had built an efficient operation. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 18 minutes of this story is where that efficiency becomes catastrophe. The problem the GUR team faced wasn't finding the pattern. The pattern was there, clear and consistent. The problem was timing the strike to catch the maximum number of aircraft on the ground at the same time. The squadron didn't always land all 12 aircraft at once. On some cycles, a 2-ship remained on station while the rest refueled. On others, the Mi-28S landed separately from the Ka-52S, with a 4 to 6 minute gap between arrivals that would leave some aircraft already back in the air when others were still fueling. For 3 consecutive observation windows, 3 full morning cycles, the GUR team documented the partial dispersal pattern and held the strike authorization. They needed all 12 on the ground at the same time. The 3 held windows weren't wasted time. They were data. Each observation cycle refined the model. The GUR team learned that the full squadron's simultaneous ground time occurred most reliably on the 3rd sortie of the morning. The mid-morning cycle after crews had flown 2 missions and the ground tempo had settled into its most predictable rhythm. The first sortie had coordination variables. The second had occasional weather holds. The third was when the squadron ran like clockwork. They would wait for the 3rd cycle. But waiting created its own problem. Ukrainian strike assets, the precision weapons and the platforms to deliver them, had to be pre-positioned and held at readiness without revealing the operation's intent to Russian ISR. Russia operated its own reconnaissance drones over the contested territory. Russian electronic warfare systems were scanning for unusual radio emissions. Moving strike assets too early, or concentrating them in a pattern that Russian analysis might recognize as pre-strike positioning, risked tipping off the squadron. The GUR team solved this by embedding the strike assets in ongoing operational activity. Ukraine was conducting drone operations across multiple sectors of the southern front during this period. Strike drones transiting toward the airfield's general direction were indistinguishable from Russian overhead observation, from dozens of other drone operations occurring simultaneously. The weapons platforms that would execute the strike were moved during a 24-hour window when Russian Orlan 10 reconnaissance drones were observed having technical difficulties. Several units had been jammed or shot down by Ukrainian electronic warfare in the days prior, degrading Russian coverage of exactly the area the strike team needed to transit. The opportunity opened. Ukrainian planners gave the strike team a 2-hour window on the morning of the 3rd sortie cycle. If the aircraft didn't achieve simultaneous ground time within that window, the strike would be aborted and the team would stand down for another cycle. The risk of holding the assets in position longer than 2 hours was assessed as unacceptable. Russian observation would eventually detect the concentration. At 9:17 a.m., the GUR team's SIGINT collection reported all 12 aircraft on final approach. The squadron commander's radio call was captured by Ukrainian collection systems. 12 aircraft, fuel states low, returning for 3rd cycle refuel. The strike authorization was transmitted. How many aircraft did Ukraine destroy in this operation? A, 8, B, 10, C, 12. The answer is coming. Stay with us. The strike package the GUR had assembled for this operation was not improvised. It had been built specifically for this target, this airfield, this geometry of aircraft on concrete. The primary weapon was a cluster of Ukrainian-developed long-range strike drones, modified platforms in the same lineage as the systems Ukraine had used in previous deep strike campaigns against Russian fuel depots and ammunition storage sites. These weren't commercial quadcopters. They were purpose-built military platforms with warheads designed to defeat light vehicle armor and unprotected aircraft. Exactly the vulnerability profile of a helicopter sitting on an apron without revetment protection. The airfield's revetment situation was part of why it had been selected as a priority target. At a proper Russian military airbase, aircraft on the ground sit inside hardened individual revetments, concrete or earthen barriers that require direct hits to defeat and that prevent blast and fragmentation from one aircraft reaching adjacent aircraft. The captured southern airfield had been modified hastily. 2 revetment positions had been constructed at the northern end, near the hangars. The remaining 10 aircraft positions on the main apron had no individual protection. When the squadron landed for the 3rd cycle, 10 aircraft would be sitting in the open, wingtip to wingtip, fuel trucks moving between them. A strike achieving mass effect on the open apron would catch the maximum number of aircraft simultaneously. The two aircraft in the partial revetments would require direct engagement. The strike package had been sized accordingly. 8 primary strike drones targeting the open apron in a coordinated multi-axis attack. 3 additional drones assigned to the revetment positions. 1 drone held in reserve for battle damage assessment and secondary engagement if initial strikes failed to achieve full effect on any aircraft. 8 drones for 10 aircraft on the open apron was a realistic allocation because the drones weren't targeting individual aircraft. They were targeting the apron itself, the fuel trucks, the armament carts, the accumulated aviation fuel sitting in hoses and trucks connecting to aircraft. 1 properly placed warhead detonating near a fuel truck on the apron would produce secondary effects reaching adjacent aircraft. The strike planners had modeled the fragmentation and blast radius of each drone's warhead against the target geometry and concluded that 8 drones could achieve comprehensive destruction of the entire open apron complex. Subscribe to Ukraine Radar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what happens in the next 4 minutes of this operation is a masterclass in strike engineering. The drones launched from their pre-positioned locations at 9:19 a.m. 2 minutes after the strike authorization, 90 seconds after the last aircraft in the formation touched down on the airfield. They flew in 3 waves, separated by 60-second intervals, designed to ensure that the initial detonations from the first wave would not create debris fields that interfered with the navigation of subsequent drones. The airfield was at the far end of the drone's effective range, which meant each platform had been carrying near maximum fuel loads. Flight time to target was approximately 22 minutes. The Russian ground crew had no idea what was inbound. At the airfield, the third cycle refuel was proceeding exactly as it had on every previous cycle. 2 Ka-52S were taxiing toward the revetments at the northern end. The remaining 8 Ka-52S and 4 Mi-28S sat on the main apron in 2 parallel lines, fuel trucks servicing them in sequence. Pilots were checking their systems, running through the abbreviated between sortie checks that the squadron's tempo demanded. Armament crews were already attaching rocket pods to the Ka-52S in the first row. Those aircraft were scheduled to launch again first, maintaining the staggered departure sequence. At the airfield operations frequency, a routine radio exchange between the ground controller and the squadron commander was captured by Ukrainian collection. Sortie 4 launch time estimated at 9:52 a.m. Everything on schedule. The first wave of drones crossed the airfield perimeter at 9:41 a.m. Russian radar systems at the airfield. A single Strela-10 short-range air defense vehicle parked near the hangar complex detected the incoming signatures at approximately 9:40 a.m. The Strela-10 is designed against fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters. Against small, low-altitude drones flying terrain-following profiles, its engagement window is narrow and its reaction time is compressed. The radar operator reported the contacts. The warning was transmitted to the airfield control frequency. The ground crew had perhaps 40 seconds to respond. 40 seconds. On an open apron with 12 aircraft and no individual revetments, there was nowhere to go. The first drone struck the center of the main apron at 9:41 a.m. and 23 seconds. The warhead detonated between a Ka-52 and a fuel truck that was still connected to the aircraft. The fuel in the truck's supply line ignited immediately. The fireball engulfed the Ka-52 and the armament cart positioned 3 meters to its rear. The ammunition on the cart, 12 Vickers missiles awaiting attachment, cooked off in the fire, adding secondary explosions that sent fragmentation across an additional 30-meter radius. The second drone struck 8 seconds later, targeting the Mi-28 formation at the apron's southern end. The warhead penetrated the first aircraft's airframe through the top surface, the thinnest armor point, and detonated internally. The Mi-28 was immediately inoperable. The blast wave from the internal detonation cracked the main rotor blades of the adjacent Mi-28, rendering it equally useless. Drone 3 arrived at 9:41 a.m. and 47 seconds, targeting the fuel truck at the far end of the apron's eastern row. The truck contained approximately 4,000 liters of aviation turbine fuel. The detonation of the drone's warhead against the truck's side panel ruptured the fuel tank. The ignition was immediate. The burning fuel cascaded across the concrete in a pool fire that spread to 3 adjacent aircraft positions within 90 seconds. What would you do differently if you were the Russian airfield commander in this scenario? Could anything have saved those aircraft once the first drone crossed the perimeter? Drop your tactical assessment in the comments. We read every one. The Strela-10 managed to engage one of the incoming drones from the first wave. Ukrainian post-strike analysis of satellite imagery confirmed one impact point consistent with an airborne detonation rather than a ground strike, suggesting a proximity intercept. But the single air defense vehicle, operating with a delayed warning and facing 8 simultaneous threat vectors across multiple azimuth angles, could not engage more than one target before the wave was inside its minimum engagement range. The second wave arrived 60 seconds after the first. By this point, the Apron was already partially obscured by smoke from the burning fuel truck and the first 2 aircraft strikes. The drone operators guiding the second wave were using thermal imaging to see through the smoke, targeting the heat signatures of aircraft and vehicles that had not yet been struck. 3 drones in the second wave engaged 3 separate aircraft in the western row, the Ka-52S that the armament crews had been loading. One of those Ka-52S had a full load of Vickers missiles already attached. When the drone struck and ignited the aircraft's fuel system, the missiles began cooking off in sequence, each detonation sending further fragmentation across the Apron. The chain reaction on the western row consumed 3 aircraft in under 4 minutes. If you believe tactics win wars, type Ukraine radar in the comments. Because what you're watching is not luck. This is preparation. This is pattern recognition. This is Ukraine turning a routine into a ruin. The 2 Ka-52S and the partial revetments presented a different challenge. The revetment walls provided lateral blast protection. The drones targeting the open Apron could not rely on splash effects to reach these aircraft. The 3 drones assigned to the revetment positions were guided individually against each aircraft's top attack profile. The Ka-52's heaviest armor is on its forward fuselage and main rotor hub. Its weakest surfaces are the engine cowlings above the airframe and the tail boom. The first revetment drone struck the lead Ka-52 through its engine cowling at 9:43 a.m., penetrating the turboshaft engine compartment and detonating inside. The resulting fire was contained by the revetment walls in terms of blast, but the aircraft itself was a total loss. The second revetment drone malfunctioned during its final approach. The Ukrainian post-strike assessment later attributed this to fragmentation damage from a secondary explosion on the Apron affecting the drone's flight control surfaces at close range. The drone impacted approximately 15 meters short of the second revetment, causing blast and fragmentation damage to the Ka-52 inside, but not achieving the internal detonation the strike planners had designed for. The reserve drone, held for exactly this contingency, was redirected. At 9:46 a.m., it struck the second Ka-52 in its revetment. The aircraft burned. At 9:48 a.m., the third wave arrived to find an airfield transformed. The main Apron was a field of fire. 6 aircraft were confirmed, destroyed on initial assessment, 3 Ka-52S and both Mi-28S from the open Apron engagements, plus 1 Ka-52 from the western row chain reaction destruction. 3 additional aircraft were severely damaged, with fire damage to fuel systems, rotor assemblies, and avionics that Ukrainian analysts assessed would take months to repair in a permissive environment. And the airfield was no longer a permissive environment. Both revetment Ka-52S were destroyed. One Mi-28 had sustained damage from the second wave that Ukrainian satellite imagery later confirmed had collapsed its main rotor gearbox. The reserve drone from the strike package conducted a reconnaissance pass over the airfield at low altitude, transmitting imagery back to the Ukrainian operators. What it captured was unprecedented, even by the standards of Ukraine's deep strike campaign. 11 of 12 aircraft from the Russian squadron were either destroyed outright or damaged beyond operational status at the airfield. The 12th, one Mi-28 that had been taxiing toward a fueling position at the airfield's far northern edge when the first strikes hit, had its crew abandon the aircraft and run when the explosions began. Russian pilots were not trained for this. They were trained to fly, to fight, to return. They were not trained for the moment when their airfield became the target. The Mi-28 crew ran. Their aircraft remained untouched by the strike, but had taken minor shrapnel damage from secondary explosions. Ukrainian assessment rated it as possibly repairable, making it the only surviving platform from the 12 aircraft formation. Satellite imagery captured in the hours following the strike showed the scale of destruction in plain terms. The main Apron, previously organized and military precise in its layout, was now a field of charred hulks. The fuel farm at the airfield's eastern edge had been ignited by the expanding pool fire from the third drone's fuel truck strike. The entire aviation fuel reserve at the facility, estimated at 60,000 liters, had burned. The hangar complex at the northern end sustained structural damage from secondary explosions. The 2 prefabricated support structures adjacent to the main Apron were collapsed. Russian forces sent a reaction helicopter, a single Mi-8 transport, not a combat asset, to the airfield approximately 90 minutes after the strike. The imagery of that Mi-8 landing amid the wreckage became one of the more widely analyzed pieces of OSINT documentation from the entire operation. A single unarmed transport helicopter landing in the ruins of what had been a 12-aircraft attack squadron. OSINT investigators later documented the communications intercepts from the Russian Aviation Command net in the hours following the strike. The traffic was notable for its volume and its tone. A senior Russian aviation commander, identified through communications analysis, transmitted a message to subordinate commands warning that forward operating patterns of helicopter squadrons needed immediate review. The message acknowledged, in language that Ukrainian interceptors characterized as unusually direct for Russian military communications, that the squadron had been systematically observed before the strike and that operational predictability had been exploited. Russia's own commanders were admitting that Ukraine had read their pattern and waited for the perfect moment. What would NATO have done differently? Could this squadron have been protected with better air defense, better operational security, better dispersal protocols? Comment your analysis below. The question of whether pattern of life vulnerability is a doctrinal failure or an unavoidable operational reality in high-tempo combat is exactly the kind of debate that Ukraine Radar exists to host. The material losses were significant by any metric. The Ka-52 Alligator unit acquisition cost and export pricing is approximately $16 million per aircraft. The Mi-28 is valued at approximately $18 million. 7 aircraft destroyed outright. 4 more assessed as total losses through subsequent damage assessment, 1 potentially repairable. The Russian military had lost between $176 and $198 million in rotary wing assets in a 20-minute window. The fuel reserve destruction, the hangar damage, the support infrastructure losses added further costs. Total material damage was assessed by Ukrainian analysts at over $220 million. The human cost was harder to quantify precisely. Russian military aviation units do not typically have pilots at their aircraft during ground refueling. The Ukrainian strike was not designed as an anti-personnel operation, but as an anti-aircraft operation. Post-strike reporting from multiple Ukrainian sources indicated that ground crew casualties occurred near the fuel truck and armament cart strikes, where personnel were working between and around the aircraft when the first wave hit. Ukrainian estimates of Russian personnel casualties in the strike ranged from 11 to 19, with the higher figure including wounded who were evacuated in the 90-minute window before a Russian ground response reached the airfield. The strategic impact extended far beyond the material numbers. Russia's rotary wing aviation had been playing an outsized role in the Southern Theater's tactical operations. Attack helicopters, flying at low altitude and using terrain masking, had been one of the tools that Russian ground commanders used to compensate for the attrition of their armored forces. The Ka-52 and Mi-28, operated in pairs or small groups, could engage Ukrainian positions and armor at standoff ranges that made them difficult to counter with man-portable air defense systems and required Ukraine to maintain constant vigilance with its shoulder-fired missiles and dedicated air defense assets. Removing a 12-aircraft formation from the theater operational picture didn't end Russian helicopter operations, but it degraded them significantly in the southern sector at a moment when Russian ground forces were already managing substantial pressure. Russian forces attempted to reconstitute helicopter coverage of the sector within 72 hours of the strike, repositioning aircraft from a different airfield located significantly further from the front. The increased transit distance cut operational sortie rates. What had been a formation capable of 4 sorties per day per aircraft from the closer position was now averaging closer to 2 sorties per day from the more distant base, because transit time consumed the time that refueling and rearming had previously made available for additional flight cycles. Ukraine's deep strike campaign against Russian logistics and rear area infrastructure had repeatedly demonstrated that distance from the front is not protection. It simply changes the problem. Russia moved its helicopters further back. Ukraine began the intelligence collection process on the new basing pattern. The cycle continued. Real tactics, real consequences. Ukraine Radar. Now let's step back and look at what this operation teaches. The first lesson is the oldest in warfare and the one most consistently violated in modern combat. Routine is vulnerability. The Russian squadron had optimized its operations for efficiency. Efficiency meant consistency. Consistency meant predictability. Predictability meant Ukraine could watch, wait, and choose the exact moment to strike. Every military commander who has studied this operation now understands that no matter how short your ground time is, 12 minutes, 8 minutes, 6 minutes, if you repeat it at the same location on a recognizable cycle, you are giving an adversary with patient intelligence collection the data to destroy you. The second lesson is about air defense and forward operating locations. The Russian squadron at this airfield was protected by a single Strela 10 vehicle, one system against a multi-axis, multi-wave drone strike. The Strela-10 managed one engagement before being overwhelmed. Any military unit operating from a location without comprehensive, layered air defense, multiple systems covering different altitude bands and engagement ranges, is accepting extreme risk in an environment where adversary long-range strike drones are a demonstrated threat. Russia's failure to resource this airfield with adequate air defense protection was not an oversight. It was a calculation. The location was considered temporary, the drones weren't expected to reach this far, the squadron was moving too fast to be targeted. All three assumptions proved fatally wrong. The third lesson is about the intelligence cycle. Ukraine's success in this operation required weeks of patient collection before a single weapon was launched. The GUAR team that watched this airfield through 3 held windows, 3 opportunities to strike early with potentially incomplete results, demonstrated the discipline that separates precision strike operations from improvised reactions. They waited for all 12 aircraft. They got all 12 aircraft. The strategic intelligence community will study the collection methodology, the pattern of life analysis, and the strike authorization process for this operation for years. The question it raises about modern warfare is fundamental. In an environment of ubiquitous satellite imagery, persistent drone reconnaissance, and SIGINT collection that can capture routine aviation radio traffic, is any forward operating location truly concealed? The answer Ukraine demonstrated here is no. Now, the answer to our quiz from earlier: how many aircraft did Ukraine destroy in this operation? The answer is C-12 aircraft were struck, with 11 assessed as destroyed or total losses and 1 assessed as potentially repairable. The 12th aircraft, the Mi-28, whose crew fled on foot when the strike began, survived the strike itself but was subsequently damaged by shrapnel from secondary explosions and assessed as requiring significant repair. For practical purposes, the Russian squadron that had been operating from this airfield ceased to exist as a combat formation. Was waiting through 3 observation windows the right tactical choice? Or did Ukraine leave 3 opportunities to strike on the table? Could the Russian squadron have survived with better air defense layering? And what would you have done differently? As the GUAR planner who had to make the call to hold the strike for the 3rd time, watching another full cycle complete without action. These are the questions that make military history more than a record of events. They shape the doctrine of the next conflict. Does Russia's pattern of life vulnerability represent a systemic doctrinal failure in Russian aviation command? Comment YES or no. And if you've studied Russian military aviation doctrine, tell us what they got wrong and what would actually have worked. Subscribe to Ukraine Radar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The analysis you get here, the collection methodology, the strike engineering, the strategic impact assessment, isn't available anywhere else at this depth, for free, on demand. The airfield is quiet now. The fuel farm long since burned out. The concrete apron stained and cratered. The hulks of 11 helicopters sitting where they died. A Soviet-era military maxim says that the best weapons are the ones the enemy never sees coming. What happened at that captured southern airfield proved something more specific and more modern. The best weapons are the ones that arrive precisely when you have become too comfortable to imagine they could. Stay vigilant. The Ukraine Radar team will have the next operation ready for you soon. And what we found about Russian command post targeting methodology will change how you think about SIGINT-driven strike planning entirely. Real tactics, real consequences. Ukraine Radar.